Like in a fever nightmare, these pilots were trying to control their aircraft, but it just wouldn't do what they asked from it. Stay tuned. The weather was partly cloudy on the evening of the 6th of February 1996, when a group of German and Polish passengers were getting ready to fly back home after a lovely stay in the Dominican Republic. There was also some thunder rumbling down to the south, with occasional rain showers coming and going over Gregario Luperon International Airport, but that was not what these passengers were paying attention to as the evening grew later and later. Instead, they were all waiting for news about when they were going to actually be able to depart. The Boeing 767, which had originally been assigned for this flight, had experienced some kind of technical issue and had therefore been grounded until some spare parts could arrive. There was no way of knowing how long that would take, meaning that it obviously couldn't be used for this flight. So the charter company, Alas Nacionales, were working hard to try and find a suitable replacement. Now at the time, Alas were working together with a Turkish company called Birgenair, and when they were contacted, it turned out that they had another aircraft, a Boeing 757, which could potentially be used instead. The only issue was that this aircraft had been sitting on the ground for quite a while, 20 days according to the final report, so it needed to be prepared properly with catering, cleaning, etc. before it could be taken back into service. This would cause a further delay, which meant that the original crew who had been scheduled to perform this flight would no longer be able to do it due to duty hours, so a completely new crew would have to be called in. This also took a bit of time, since most of this new crew would have to be called in from their scheduled off days, but at around 22:15, the 3 pilots and most of the 10 cabin crew had finally reported to the airport. The pilots started to immediately look through their flight plans and briefing data to see what they had ahead of them. The plan was that they would initially fly up to Gander in Canada and then fly onwards to Berlin-Schönefeld and finally to Frankfurt in Germany. Because this would be a very long duty, a 3rd pilot had also been assigned to act as a relief pilot, and together they now looked at the weather and the NOTAMs for the planned 3 legs. Like I mentioned before, it was raining on and off in Puerto Plana, and there was also some thunderstorm activity down to the south, but that shouldn't affect their northerly route. The weather for the rest of the flight looked okay, and so did the flight plan, high-level charts and NOTAMs, so they soon decided on the fuel and walked over to the cabin crew to start briefing them about what to expect. Now, it was likely in this briefing that they were informed that one of the cabin crew had not arrived yet and would be coming in about 1 hour's time. There wasn't much that they could do about that, so the pilots just continued to brief the crew about what they were expecting in terms of turbulence, weather and special requests, and after that they proceeded to gather out of the aircraft, which had now been brought forward from the storage parking stand. It was a gleaming-looking, 12-year-old Boeing 757-200, equipped with 2 RB211 535E4 engines, which had been leased to Birgenair 3 years earlier in 1993. Like I mentioned before, it had been sitting on the ground for the last few weeks, and during that time an engine test had been carried out in the form of a ground run, which had been fully successful. But after that test had been completed, there was no indication in the tech log that the covers protecting the engines and the pitot tubes had been fitted, nor if they had been installed in the first place. So what does that mean then? Well, if an aircraft is going to be staying on the ground for more than a few hours without supervision, it's a good idea to try and cover any openings or parts of the aircraft where dust, insects, birds and other wildlife could potentially get in. The engines are therefore normally covered, but another system which is hugely sensitive to any kind of blockage is something known as the Pitot-static system. You see, it's super important for us pilots to always know what our indicated airspeed is, as well as our altitude of course, and the most reliable way that we have to keep track of these parameters is by measuring certain pressure differences. Down on the ground, the static air pressure is around 1013 hectopascals, but as we climb, that pressure will decrease in an almost linear way, at least for the first couple of kilometers. This means that if we can continuously measure that pressure outside of the aircraft, we can, with the help of a quite simple mathematical model, calculate how high up we are at any given time. Now, there are some corrections that has to be made to get this really accurate, but for the purpose of this explanation, they are very small. But when it comes to measuring the indicated airspeed, things becomes a little bit more complicated. First, let me address one of the most common misconceptions about airspeed. When most people hear the word speed, they immediately picture an object that is moving in relation to another object. In most cases, the only speed we get in contact with is the speed relative to the ground, since that's what's important when you're out on your bike, motorcycle or car. We use that speed information to calculate how quickly we can get from one place to another or how much fines we need to pay if the police stops us. But airspeed is something slightly different. Airspeed has less to do with getting from A to B, and much more to do with how much air is actually flowing over the aircraft's wings and control surfaces, which is what actually keeps an aircraft flying, making it one of the single most important parameters for us pilots to know. Of course, we do also want to know how quickly we will get from A to B, and this is derived by calculating our ground speed. But that speed, even though it is of course somewhat connected to the airspeed, can be wildly different from the indicated airspeed. Just to illustrate this, picture a small aircraft that's flying with a constant speed of 100 knots. It is heading straight into a storm with an average opposite wind speed also of 100 knots. In the cockpit of that aircraft, the pilot will see his airspeed being constant at 100 knots, but if he looks down towards the ground, the aircraft will be standing completely still, appearing to hover over the ground as his ground speed is effectively zero. This doesn't in any way mean that the aircraft is in any danger, since the air needed to keep it flying is still there, flowing over its wings. It's just not getting it anywhere. The same way is also true for those articles that you sometimes see about aircraft that are crossing the Atlantic at record speeds. They are not overspeeding in any way. Instead, they are flying the same indicated airspeed as they always do, but with a lot of tailwind. So with this in mind, we can get back to the Pitot-static system needed for showing us this indicated airspeed. Like I mentioned before, we do this by measuring air pressure, but in a different way than we measure the altitude. The pressure used for the altitude is measured via static ports, situated on both sides of the aircraft, but since the speed needs to capture the dynamic pressure, this is done with the help of something known as Pitot tubes or Pitot probes, which are these pistol-looking things that are protruding normally on each side of the cockpit and on the fin in the back. When the aircraft starts moving, the air will move in through the hole in the front of these tubes, which is where the total pressure will be measured. That value will then be fed into, in the case of larger aircraft like the Boeing 757, an air data computer, which will convert it into digital signals and subtract the static background pressure. This computer will then use signals from the aircraft's angle of attack sensor, since the pressure might change depending on which angle the aircraft is flying at, as well as the outside air temperature. And once all of those corrections are made, the signals will be fed to the pilot's primary flight display, which will show the correct speed and altitude to us pilots. Each pilot's display is connected to their own separate static and Pitot probes, as well as their own air data computer, so the speeds are derived independently, and since this information is so critical, we also have a standby system, which is connected to yet another separate set of probes. In the case of the 757, the probes connected to this standby systems are not connected through a computer, but are instead the raw, uncorrected values from those probes. Now, those of you who are a little bit eagle-eyed will maybe see a weakness here. Those Pitot probes only have one small hole in the front, so what happens if that hole gets blocked for some reason? Well, I will tell you all about that after this short message. If there is one thing that I want you to bring with you from this story, it's how important your understanding of basic physics is, as well as your ability to think quickly and be prepared for anything. The world around us is changing super fast, and the only way to make sure that we're prepared for it is by constantly learning and improving. That's why I am so happy to have Brilliant as the sponsor for this video, since they are the best, most efficient and frankly most fun way that I've found to do just that. Brilliant offers thousands of interactive lessons who, just like my channel, make complicated concepts simple and easy to learn. It doesn't matter if it's AI, maths or computer science, their courses are designed to sharpen your logic and problem-solving skills in a really fun and hands-on way. For me, Brilliant's course on how large language models work has been a real game changer, and it actually helped me to introduce my AI, Aidan, into the Mentour app, where it's now helping people with their fear of flying. But one of the best things with Brilliant is that you can learn on the go. So instead of just mindlessly scrolling, I now try to use that time for daily learning sessions instead. Now, if you want to level up your skills, then head over to brilliant.org/mentorpilot by clicking on the link here below or using this QR code. This will give you a free 30-day trial and an awesome 20% discount on the annual premium subscription. Thank you, Brilliant. Now let's continue. The Boeing 757 that this crew was now going to fly had been parked for several weeks when it was time for it to get back into service again. And like I mentioned before, the engines and probe covers had likely not been installed during parts or even this entire duration. That would have exposed the various probes of the aircraft to the elements and insects, and there was one insect in particular which posed a particularly big threat here, the mud dauber wasp. This insect was active in the Dominican Republic at the time, and its nesting habits included building a single-cell nest inside of small holes or openings using, as its name suggests, mud. Now, we don't know if this is what happened in this case, but the mud wasp had caused problems with pitot pubes in other cases, which I explained actually in this video. Anyway, the pilots who were going to operate this flight were likely not aware of this particular threat and wouldn't have known if the covers had been installed or not. Checking the pitot probes does form part of the pre-flight inspection, but the probes are mounted so high up that we can only really check that they are not damaged or doesn't look damaged. Actually checking inside of them would require a set of very tall steps and likely a trained engineer. Now, there were specific maintenance procedures for testing this system, and according to Boeing, those tests were recommended before flight if an aircraft had been grounded for an extended amount of time, but in this case, this had not been done. As the pilots entered the cockpit, they decided that the captain was going to be pilot flying on the first flight, and the first officer would therefore be operating as pilot monitoring. The relief pilot was not formally on duty yet, but he would be sitting on the jump seat in the cockpit during the takeoff anyway. So, who were these pilots then? Well, the captain was 62 years old and a Turkish citizen. He was very experienced with close to 25,000 hours of total time, of which 1,875 had been flown on the Boeing 757. And record shows that he had not flown for the previous 10 days before the flight. Now, we don't know much about his previous experience and training records, except that Birgenair was using external training centers in the US to train their crews. At the time, it had not yet been mandated to do CRM training in Turkey, and the crews had therefore not gone through this particular training. The first officer was also Turkish and 34 years old. He had amassed about 3,500 hours of total time, but only 71 of those had been flown on the Boeing 757, meaning that he was basically brand new on the type. The relief captain was 51 years old and also from Turkey, and he had about 15,000 hours and was also very new on the 757 with only 121 hours on it. But since the final report was not very detailed, we don't know if these pilots had actually more experience on the very similar Boeing 767 that Birgenair also used, and which share the same type rating as the 757. Anyway, as soon as the crew entered the aircraft, the cabin crew started going through the security checks as the captain started preparing the cockpit for departure. The first officer went outside to do the walk-around, but didn't find anything out of the ordinary when he did that. Soon, the last remaining cabin crew member also arrived, which meant that the passengers could finally start boarding, and it's safe to assume that most of them would have felt quite tired at this point, but likely very happy to finally be on their way. Now, we don't know much of the discussions that happened in the cockpit during the final parts of the cockpit preparation because the final report only included events after the takeoff roll had been started. But we do know that the aircraft was within weight and balance limitations and that the performance and V-speed calculations were all correctly done. Once the boarding was complete, there were 176 passengers and 13 crew members on board, and the cabin crew closed the doors and reported to the captain that they were now ready for departure. So, at around 20 minutes past 11, the first officer requested startup clearance, and only minutes later the majestic Boeing 757 started taxiing out for takeoff from runway 08. It was almost completely dark at this point, with the moon only occasionally peeking out behind the clouds at 7,000 feet, and light rain was falling, and the winds were coming from an east-southeasterly direction at 10 knots. A very pleasant night for flying, in other words. The pilots completed their before takeoff checks and everything appeared completely normal. There were no warnings of any kind, and the pilots were likely just completing their normal procedures and chatting about the departure that they were just about to fly. At around 23:42 and 11 seconds, the aircraft had lined up on the runway and the air traffic controller cleared Birgenair flight 301 for takeoff. The captain pressed the toga buttons and then made sure that the auto throttle correctly started moving the thrust levers forward into the selected takeoff thrust. He then called EPR select, and as the engines roared into action, the first officer responded EPR power set, as the captain started focusing his attention outside, just as he would have done thousands of times before. Now, before we get into the accident sequence here, it's important to explain a few things regarding standard operating procedures during the takeoff roll. In most airlines, it's the captain who takes the decision to either continue or reject the takeoff based on whatever information they have at the moment, and it is therefore super important for the other crew members to clearly speak up if they notice anything unusual. The takeoff roll is divided into two defined phases, the low and the high speed regime, and the divider between those two is normally a speed which varies between 80 and 100 knots depending on aircraft type. During the low speed regime, the aircraft has not yet built up much kinetic energy and also haven't used up much runway, meaning that it's considered very safe to reject the takeoff at those speeds. Because of that, we are taught to reject for basically any warning, unusual noise or vibrations in this regime, but once we pass into the high speed part of the takeoff, that becomes a bit trickier. At that point, the aircraft will have used up more runway and is also traveling at a significantly higher speed, therefore requiring more braking distance to stop. So once we have passed this point, which is 80 knots in the Boeing 757, we only really reject for engine failure, fire, predictive wind shear warning, blocked runway, or the aircraft unsafe or unable to fly. Now, it is important to point out that the aircraft can safely reject all the way up until we reach the decision speed of V1, but it's been found that it's much safer in general to take any minor issues into the air and then just fly a circuit back home and land again with the whole runway available if needed, than doing a high-speed rejected takeoff or anything outside of that list that I just said. But the thing that I want you to think about here is the phrase unable or unsafe to fly. All the other scenarios, engine failure, fire, predictive wind shear warning or blocked runway, are very clear-cut and requires minimum decision-making by the captain. But unsafe or unable to fly requires a subjective decision which can be based on many different parameters. This is worth remembering as we now get back into the cockpit of Flight 301 again. A few seconds into the takeoff roll, the first officer called out 80 knots, which, as I just explained, was the divider between the two takeoff phases. But this call is also a first cross-check of the two primary speed indicators. The idea is that this call should prompt the pilot flying to cross-check that their airspeed indicator is similar to what the pilot monitoring just called, and the call-out should be then checked if it is. But in this case, something strange was clearly going on, because the captain's airspeed had not started to move at all when the first officer made this call. The captain still responded checked, likely out of just pure habit, but he then immediately followed that up with, my airspeed isn't working. This was followed 2 seconds later by the first officer responding, yes, yours not working, and 120. Here the aircraft was obviously accelerating massively, so the captain would have needed to take a decision quickly. Was this unsafe or unable to fly? He asked, is yours working? And the first officer looked down and reported, yes sir, which was quickly followed by the captain saying, you tell me. So what had happened here was likely quite simple. Something had clearly blocked the captain's pitot tube, causing his speed indication to fail completely. If he would have taken the decision to reject immediately when he noticed that, this would have just been another routine delay, which would have further annoyed the passengers, but you and I would have never heard of it. But since he was slightly indecisive here, he was quickly pushed further and further into a corner when he knew that a rejected takeoff would become a more and more risky maneuver. On top of that, he knew that the runway was wet, and also he knew that at the end of runway 08 there was just a lot of rocks before the ocean started, so for every passing second he would have become less and less inclined to reject. That's likely why, as soon as the first officer responded that he had good airspeed indications, he just decided to keep going and then followed the speed guidance of the first officer when he called V1 and rotate, only about 2 seconds later. It's easy to sit here and judge this decision after the fact, but I completely understand why this happened. Anyway, the captain now rotated the aircraft normally, which meant that the 757 soon got airborne and started climbing swiftly into the dark night. 7 seconds into the flight, the captain called, "Positive climb, gear up," to which the first officer responded, "Positive climb," and then moved the gear selector up. The captain still didn't have any reliable speed indication at this point and was likely just climbing with an attitude that he was used to, slightly below 15 degrees nose up initially, which should soon start to be decreased. But now, something else really strange started happening. Something that would ultimately bring this crew into much more trouble. You see, if the captain's airspeed indication would have just stayed at 0, this would have likely not been such a big problem. It would have been obvious what to do, just hand the controls over to the first officer at some point. But now it suddenly came alive and started increasing rapidly. So as the first officer suggested that they should engage LNAV, the captain agreed, but soon also called out, "It began to operate," meaning that he now saw his airspeed indication increasing and thought that it was maybe functional again. But was it really airspeed that he was seeing here? Remember how the airspeed indicator works, how it uses the dynamic pressure hitting the probe to show the speed. The problem is that if the pitot probe is completely blocked, then the air trapped inside will soon start to expand due to lowering outside pressure as the aircraft climbs, effectively turning the airspeed indicator into an altimeter. And what happens with an altimeter when the aircraft climbs? Yeah, it starts going up. So as this aircraft now climbed higher and higher, so did the captain's airspeed. And for a short while, it would have probably coincided quite well with what the first officer was seeing on his side. This is why airspeed indication problems can be so insidious. They rarely behave the same way twice, and they can affect 1, 2, or all 3 airspeed indicators, making the identification very tricky to do. Back in 1996, this was not very well understood, and Birgenair had only recently introduced descriptions in their manuals for how to deal with these type of problems, but it's unsure if those descriptions had found their way into their pilot training programs, especially in the external training centers that these pilots had been using. On top of this, there were no indications on the pilot's primary flight displays warning them of unreliable airspeed or airspeed disagree, nor were there any QRH checklists to follow. Those checklists obviously exist today, but they were created later, after this flight. So the only way to deal with this would have been to quickly cross-check the 3 airspeed indicators and then, based on that, decide which one, if any, they could trust. If this would have been done, the pilots would have quickly seen that the first officer's speed correlated well with the standby speed indicator, and the captain should have then just handed over the controls to the first officer, but that sadly didn't happen. Instead, things would now start to become even darker as more and more systems started to get involved. You see, the automation systems like the autopilot and the autothrottle rely on several different sources of information in order to do their work. And a very important one of those is the speed information, since it will tell the autopilot how much to pitch in order to maintain a specific airspeed. In most climb modes, the thrust will be set constantly to climb thrust, so the only way to regulate the speed is by pitching up more or less. That means, for example, if the speed keeps increasing, well, then the autopilot will interpret that as the aircraft having more available energy and will pitch up higher. And it will continue to do so until the speed has stabilized as selected by the pilots. Maybe you can start to see where the problem lies here. So the aircraft now continued to climb with the captain still in control. For the next minute, the cockpit work continued as normal, with the pilots turning off the windshield wipers, the captain asking for climb thrust to be set and for VNAV to be engaged so that the aircraft could start following the planned vertical profile. And in this case, VNAV used the captain's airspeed indication for its calculations. There doesn't seem to have been any particular problems identified during this first minute of flight, and the stress levels in the cockpit remained quite low. At around time 23:43 and 16 seconds, the first officer set the flaps up speed for the captain, meaning that they could now start to accelerate in order to retract the flaps. And apparently the captain saw a constant acceleration here because the flaps were retracted in a reasonably normal fashion. Once the flap retraction was completed, the captain asked for the after takeoff checklist and the first officer started going through it. No issues noted at all so far. The controller now came in and cleared the flight to climb and maintain flight level 280 and report point Påkeg, which was quickly read back and set on the mode control panel by the first officer. As the aircraft climbed through 3,500 feet, the captain asked for the center autopilot to be engaged, which the first officer immediately complied with, and since the center autopilot also takes its information from the captain's instruments, this meant that from this point on in the flight, both the autothrottle and the autopilot were fully engaged and both were taking information from the captain's side. Next, both pilots set standard pressure, 1013 hectopascals on their altimeters since they had just been cleared to climb to a flight level. But now, something else happened which showed that things were maybe not as fine as they seemed. A master caution warning suddenly illuminated, accompanied by an oral chime and Mach airspeed trim and rudder ratio advisory messages appearing on the ACAS display. Now the reason for these messages was that both the Mach airspeed trim, which automatically trims the horizontal stabilizer, and the rudder ratio, which limits movement of the rudder at certain speeds, require reliable airspeed to function properly. And since at this point there existed an increasing difference between the left and right air data computed output, these systems just warned that they couldn't do what they were supposed to do. But none of these failures specifically pointed the pilots towards an unreliable airspeed as the cause. The captain called out the indications when they appeared, but the first officer initially didn't have much to add to it, beyond just confirming them. The captain muttered that there's something wrong, there are some problems, while the first officer instead turned his attention to the navigation and pointed out that they should proceed direct to a point called Påkeg, not giving the alerts much further attention. 20 seconds after the failure messages had appeared, the captain said, "There is something crazy, do you see it?" And the first officer responded, "There is something crazy there. Right now, mine is only 200 and decreasing, sir." It's likely that since the ACAS messages included Mach airspeed, this had brought the pilot's attention down to their indicated airspeeds, which on the captain's side was rising, causing the aircraft to pitch up more and more, but on the first officer's side was now decreasing rapidly. Like I said before, the faulty indications on the captain's side was now causing all of the automatics to try and reduce the speed by pitching up, but that just caused the air inside of the captain's blocked pitot tube to expand even faster, leading to an even higher indicated airspeed and even more pitch up. So whilst the real airspeed was now washing off quickly, this was not understood by the automation on board, nor by the crew. Now, it was at this point, when the first officer pointed out his falling airspeed and what the stress had not yet risen too much, that the crew had their first and maybe best chance to solve this problem. A quick use of a decision-making acronym like PIOC would have led the crew to look at what their problem was, strange indications and different airspeeds, and then what information they had, the ACAS info, higher pitch than normal, the fact that the first officer's airspeed had worked before during the takeoff and was now falling, as well as the fact that the speeds were the same on the first officer's and the standby instruments, but not on the captain's side. They could then have looked at what options they had, handing the controls over to the pilot with the working airspeed, disconnecting the automatics and pitch down to a reasonable value, which would have been around 5 degrees pitch up, to just keep the aircraft safe, and then executing that decision rapidly to de-escalate the situation. After that, they would have been able to calmly evaluate if it had worked. PIOC, in other words. But PIOC is a decision-making concept that we teach during crew resource management training, something that these pilots had not yet been given. So instead, the confusion now continued to steadily get worse and worse. Instead of cross-checking the 3 airspeed indicators, the captain now just assumed that both his and the first officer's indications were wrong. He called out, "Both of them are wrong, what can we do?" As well as, "Let's check the circuit breakers," which the first officer agreed with. And checking circuit breakers is an age-old way of solving problems pilots just don't understand. And whilst it's certainly something to think of in case of completely lost indications or functions, it wouldn't solve the problem of incorrect or differing instrument readings. Only a few seconds later, the captain said something that could have also solved this entire ordeal. He pointed out that the alternate is correct, and this was then almost immediately followed by the first officer confirming that, yeah, it was. Now, if you find yourself in a situation like this, finding a working speed indication is absolutely crucial. So if the pilots both agreed that the alternate speed indicator was showing the correct values here, that's what the captain should have relied on. But unfortunately, it seems like the overall feeling of confusion about the aircraft's behavior had now taken the upper hand. Because only 5 seconds after the pilots had confirmed that the standby airspeed was correct, the captain said, as the aircraft was not flying and on the ground, something happening is normal, such as elevator asymmetry and other things. This was a correct observation of the fact that the aircraft had been grounded for an extended amount of time, and it's not uncommon for things like switches to be left in the wrong positions by maintenance personnel or even these type of issues to appear in those cases. But this reasoning didn't help him here, since it likely just made him continue to look for other causes of what they were experiencing, rather than just focusing on the one thing that was obvious: the speeds. We know he was reasoning like this because the very next thing that the captain said was, "We don't believe them," likely referring to the ACAS warnings that they could be disregarded, and that shows that he maybe thought that this was just some kind of transient or faulty issue altogether. The time was now 23:45 and 28 seconds, and the aircraft had climbed to 6,688 feet. The indicated airspeed on the captain's side had by this point risen to 352 knots, and the aircraft was pitching up with 15.1 degrees, a combination which should be obviously impossible, especially with a heavy aircraft just after departure. Now, the maximum allowed indicated airspeed of the Boeing 757 is 350 knots, and since the captain's airspeed at this point indicated above that, the overspeed warning now suddenly also activated in the cockpit. This would have added significant stress to the situation, so the captain correctly said, "Okay, it's no matter," and then asked the pilot on the jump seat to pull the circuit breaker for that warning. Now, I'm saying that this was correct here because the overspeed warning was obviously activated by the captain's incorrect speed indication, but unfortunately, the fact that they disregarded this warning would soon also cause them to disregard another warning, one that was still very much valid. You see, as you remember, the speed indication had steadily been increasing on the captain's side, but it had also been decreasing on the first officers and on the standby ADI. And anyone who have been following this channel for a while knows what this means. The aircraft was now getting closer and closer to an aerodynamic stall. But the confusion in the cockpit was not getting any better. Soon the first officer called, "Now it's 350, yes?" Obviously reading the speed from the captain's side and not from his own, and this might have told the captain that maybe his speed was correct after all, because even though he had correctly called out the erroneous overspeed warning before, he now suddenly disconnected the auto throttle and pulled back the thrust levers. Most likely to try and reduce the speed that he was seeing in front of him. At this point, someone also disconnected VNAV and replaced it with the vertical speed mode, followed by the selection of a climb that forced the nose of the aircraft further up, first to 15 and then 18 degrees. This was literally the last thing that this aircraft needed, so about 20 seconds after the overspeed alarm had been silenced, 4 alert tones could suddenly be heard, followed by the activation of the stick shaker, telling the pilots that the aircraft was now getting close to a fully developed stall. It's important to understand here the difference between the overspeed and the stick shaker warnings, and that is that the stick shaker doesn't only take speed into account. It also receives input from something known as the alpha vanes, which are little wing-looking probes on each side of the aircraft. These vanes can feel the angle of the oncoming air, and together with the air data computers, they then calculate the aircraft's angle of attack, meaning the angle between the wing's chord line and the air rushing towards it. And it's actually that angle of attack, not the speed, that determines when a wing stalls, which is something that is wildly misunderstood. Anyway, the effect of this is that the stick shaker warning on the Boeing 757 is far more reliable than the overspeed warning is. And if these pilots would have fully appreciated that and reacted to it, they still would have had time to get out of this situation. The correct response to this warning, the approach to stall recovery technique, would have been for the pilot flying to disconnect the autopilot and autothrottle, smoothly apply forward pitch, if needed, roll in the shortest direction towards wings level, and then smoothly push the thrust levers forward, whilst making sure that the speed brakes were also fully retracted. But what now happened was instead something very, very different. The thrust levers were almost immediately pushed forward, but the autopilot remained engaged until just a few seconds later, when it disconnected automatically since it had reached its limit of operational authority. But the nose of the aircraft was never pushed forward. And since that wasn't happening, the aircraft now started to enter a full stall, with its wings rocking slowly from left to right, accompanied by an accelerating descent. As this was happening, there were a lot of signs that the pilots just couldn't wrap their heads around what they were seeing. The jump-seating pilots called out ADI, possibly to make the pilots focus on their attitude and pitch forward, but he wasn't more specific than that. The operating pilots were switching between exasperated calls and desperate suggestions of what to do, all whilst the aircraft kept descending in a deeper and deeper stall, with the stick shaker continuously activated. Now, there was another way for the pilots to get somewhat of an indication of what their speed was, and that was the ground speed indication. Now, that was obviously sensitive to the wind, but would have given a general indication, and it was now indicating 140 knots, or about 60 knots lower than the safe speed for a Boeing 757 in this clean configuration that they were now flying. But none of the pilots had any mental capacity to look at that. The panic had now thoroughly grabbed hold of them as they desperately tried to figure out why their aircraft wasn't responding to their inputs. They knew that there was something wrong with their airspeed, but just couldn't seem to figure out what that was. And that fact was further shown as the captain called out, "Disconnect the autopilot. Is the autopilot disconnected?" whilst he at the same time again closed the thrust levers. The first officer responded that the autopilot was indeed already disconnected, and this was followed by the captain pulling back on his yoke, with the thrust levers still completely closed. Both actions you would never do in a stall, and a clear sign of a complete loss of situational awareness. From this point onwards, the energy state of the aircraft just kept getting worse and worse, and with that, even higher confusion from the pilots. The pilot on the jump seat again now called out ADI, but without any more context, and the captain said, "Not climbing, what am I to do?" obviously not understanding that the aircraft was now fully stalled and basically falling. The first officer tried to help his struggling colleague with a suggestion, saying, "You should level off, altitude, okay? I'm selecting altitude hold, sir." Which the panic captain just agreed to, even though that selection would only tell the flight directors what to show, nothing else, since the autopilot wasn't engaged, and even if it would have been, it wouldn't have made any difference. But the first officer selected altitude hold and called out, "Okay, 5,000 feet," since that was the altitude that they were descending through at the time. But as he was doing that, the aircraft suddenly rolled over into a steep right bank, whilst the descent rate just increased even further. Somewhere around here, the captain must have understood that whatever was happening with his aircraft was not helped by the thrust levers being in idle. So he now called out, "Thrust levers, thrust, 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 thrust," and pushed the two thrust levers forward. The first officer responded, "Retard?" maybe as an indication of where the thrust levers were at that point, or as a question of if that was what the captain wanted. But the captain quickly called back, in a really panicked voice, "Thrust, don't pull back, don't pull back, don't pull back, don't pull back," to which the first officer responded, "Okay, they're open now." But it was too late. As the pilots continued shouting about the position of the thrust levers, the aircraft started rolling over into a left steep bank instead. And as it did so, the airflow into the left-hand engine likely got so disrupted by the unusual body angle that it developed something known as a compressor stall, which in short meant that it stopped producing thrust. And this was the final nail in the coffin. The almost fully stalled aircraft was now also subjected to asymmetric thrust in the form of full thrust from the right-hand side and close to no thrust from the left-hand side. And this, in combination with a rapid left roll and the opposite aileron input from the captain, led to the aircraft entering into something known as a spin, where it continued rolling about 360 degrees around its roll axis, whilst also pitching down almost vertically. And this was all happening at around 3,500 feet over the black Atlantic Ocean below. The pilot on the jump seat now pleaded, "Sir, pull up!" But this was only met by the two operating pilots shouting questions about what's happening. As the aircraft fell through around 2,000 feet, the ground proximity warning system activated with a futile
"Sink rate. Pull up."
But this aircraft was now completely out of control. The final attitude recorded was a left bank of 34.6 degrees with a pitch down of 34.3 degrees and a terrifying vertical speed of negative 10,200 feet per minute. At time 23:47 and 26 seconds, Birgenair Flight 301 impacted the ocean about 20 kilometers away from the coastline, instantly killing everyone on board. And this happened only 5 minutes and 15 seconds after they had taken off. When air traffic control couldn't get in contact with the aircraft, they soon sounded the alarm and a massive search and rescue effort was initiated. Debris were soon found floating on the sea surface, which included coffee cans that had been flattened to the likeness of tinfoil by the massive impact forces. The rescue attempts were abandoned 2 days after the crash, and instead the hunt to try and locate the wreckage and the black boxes continued using special remote-controlled submersibles. And on the 28th of February, 22 days after the accident, the recorders were finally found at a depth of 7,200 feet, and when they were examined, they were found to both be in working condition, with only minor lapses recorded during the accident flight. The calibrated airspeed was found to be completely unreliable, specifically on the captain's side, in a manner consistent with how the reading would look if the captain's pitot tube had been completely blocked. But the actual pitot tubes were never recovered, so the cause of the blockage could never be 100% confirmed, even though the black and yellow mud Dauber was strongly suspected to be the culprit. The final report, which was very limited by the way, found that the causes of the accident was the failure by the flight crew to recognize the activation of the stick shaker as an imminent warning of the entrance into an aerodynamic stall, followed by a failure to execute the correct recovery procedures. The reasons behind the pilot's failure to regain their situational awareness was found to have been a combination of lacking training around unreliable airspeed scenarios, lack of procedural guidance, poor technical understanding of the aircraft's automation systems, airspeed indications and warning systems, as well as a lack of crew resource management. The fact that the pitot covers had not been installed after the maintenance procedure 2 days prior to the crash was also pointed to as a contributing cause, as well as the lack of clear, unreliable airspeed warnings in the cockpit. This accident became a real wake-up call for the industry, since it highlighted how very confusing unreliable airspeed events could really be. The investigation recommended that Boeing should install new warnings for the pilots, which ultimately led to the airspeed disagree warnings we now have, as well as new procedures and training scenarios for pilots. These new procedures included memory items, which had to be executed immediately if an unreliable airspeed was suspected, and they clarified the importance of cross-checking the 3 airspeed indicators in order to hand over controls to the pilot with the good indications. Since then, though, these procedures have changed again, and today the very first thing that pilots have to do if they suspect a problem with their airspeed is to disconnect the automatics and flight directors and then set a specific pitch and thrust setting, for example 4 degrees pitch up and 75% of thrust. By doing this, we know that the aircraft will keep flying, and definitely at all different altitudes, which then gives us time to properly troubleshoot the problem without the risk of losing control of the aircraft. But it would take another horrific accident for these new procedures to be implemented, and you can watch that story here. Now, I hope that I've earned a subscription from you, and if you want to see my next video ahead of everyone else and even have a chance to impact its content, then please join my Patreon crew using the link below, which is patreon.com/join/mentorpilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.